Hey there! This video is about overheating and run times for the Canon R8. Now, when the R8 was first announced, I was personally very concerned about overheating because they took the same sensor out of the R6 Mark II, which has a really nice 6K oversampled 4K, and they put it in a smaller body design. Of course, this camera doesn't have a fan or anything like that, so when you take a camera that has an oversampled image and you put it in a small body design like the R8, of course, we have potential for serious overheating. So one thing I do want to point out is that Canon is pretty upfront and they publish their expectations in their specifications for overheating and runtimes. So take a look here. You can see that Canon says that you should get 30 minutes in 4K 60. And in 4K 30 or 4K 24, that you should get about 2 hours. Now, I'm not really sure if the 2 hours has to do with total runtime or the fact that the R8 has a 2-hour record limit, like an old school Canon cripple record limit. So we'll test that out to see if it can run for longer than 2 hours after you restart the camera and those sorts of things. Now, there are a few notes here with their specifications that basically they tested it in a 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degree Fahrenheit environment from a cold start. So what I've done is I'm gonna verify this in my studio here, which is usually between 70 and 75 degrees. And every time I do a test, I will start it from a cold start. So I'll let the camera completely cool down before I start the running. Now, keep in mind that if you are using the camera or if it is warmer outside, these times that you see here, they will be shorter because the camera will obviously be warmer before you start recording. Another thing that's cool about the Canon system is that they have a metering system that goes from 0 to 10 bars. And I find this really helpful to kind of know where the camera's at. Now, previous Canon cameras and also some other brands like Sony, they'll just have like a warning and then it goes to overheating. But this will show you from 0 to 10 bars and you can kind of get a sense of how warm the camera's getting. Now, so far, I've done a little bit of shooting with the camera and I did a first impressions video, which you should definitely check out. I'll leave that link down in the description. Got some great footage. I was really impressed with the image, but really no surprise because it has the same sensor as the R6 Mark II. And in my opinion, it was pretty similar in terms of image quality, dynamic range, colors, and all that sort of stuff. Now, for that video, I shot mainly in 4K 24, and it was around 80 or 85 degrees Fahrenheit that day, and it really hasn't been that warm since then here in late April in North Carolina. Now, when I was shooting that day, I was in and out of the sun and fairly short clips, and I did get the overheat meter to get to a few bars, but it really didn't get super high and the camera did not overheat. So I was pretty impressed with it out in actual shooting situations. Now, this past weekend I was down at my parents' place in South Carolina and I was shooting a little bit in 4K 60 because there was a cool alligator right behind their house and I just pulled out the camera to get a few shots and it was pretty cool to see the alligator and get these shots. But I didn't use the camera a whole bunch, but I did notice that the camera was heating up pretty quickly in 4K 60. I did have the screen closed because I was holding up to my eye when I was shooting with my 100 to 500, but I again wasn't using it for a long period of time, and it did seem to recover pretty quickly, but I just want to point that out that it does heat up pretty quickly in 4K 60 when you're out shooting. Now, onto the tests, and I want to explain how I did them. So of course I used the R8, but I used the RF 24 to 70. Here in my studio, it was between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really not that warm out right now, and I'm probably gonna have to revisit some of this testing in the summer when it gets a lot warmer here because it gets pretty toasty in North Carolina. All the tests were done in 4K IPB, which is the highest quality that you can record internally inside the R8. Of course, that's the 6K oversampled 4K, and in all of the 4K modes, you're gonna get that oversampling. There's no way to turn it off like it is in some of the other cameras. Shot in C-Log 3, autofocus was on, lens state was on, electronic state was on, not the enhanced. I had it on a tripod with the LCD screen flipped open. Now, anytime you are looking to increase the runtime or decrease the overheating potential of a camera, always open up the screen and keep it on tripod. Try to get maximum amount of airflow. You don't want to leave it flat on a table. This will give you longer runtimes. One other thing I want to point out about overheating tests is that there are pretty much infinite ways of conducting all these tests, and I'm sure there's probably a few other tests that you'd probably like me to see done, but I think the ones that I chose will give us a pretty good understanding of what's going on with the R8. For the first test, we'll take a look at 4K 60. The R8 overheated in 23 minutes. This was a little surprising and not surprising at the same time. Now, I didn't expect it to get a really long runtime, but Canon did state 30 minutes, and I got 23 minutes. Now, I did run this test again, and I got around 22 minutes, and so I think that test is pretty accurate, so a little bit less than they stated, but again, I didn't expect a long record time in this camera in 4K 60. Now, to put this in perspective, I did test the R6 Mark II a while ago when that camera came out in a very similar situation here in the studio, and in 4K 60, I got 43 minutes, and Canon only stated 30 minutes for that in their specifications. So you get about double the record time in 4K 60 on the R6 Mark II than you do on the R8. And of course, it definitely has to do with the larger body design. Now, I do want to take a moment to talk about how people actually use 4K 60, because I think for most of us out there, 4K 60 is used for B-roll or short clips and those sorts of things. For me personally, if I'm out shooting wildlife, I can take a few shots, I can turn the camera off, it can cool down a little bit. Now, there are some use cases where people want to shoot 4K 60 for extended periods of time. I know some wedding videographers shoot the whole wedding in 4K 60. If you're doing a whole lot of real estate and the camera's running for a long period of time and you want to shoot 4K 60, I mean, there are a few cases where you might want to use that, but for most people, you're not going to just set it up on a tripod and let it run in 4K 60 until it overheats. So keep that in mind. Maybe this works for you, maybe it doesn't. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that when I was out shooting and I had the camera in 4K 60 and flipped it over to 4K 24, the overheating reading changed and dropped significantly. Now, I don't know if there's just a different scale or upper limit of heat that it can run in 4K 24 versus 4K 60, but I found that pretty interesting. Now, I didn't do any formal recovery time tests, but it seems to recover pretty quickly. Now onto 4K 24, which personally is something that I was most interested in testing, because I think for a lot of people out there, including myself, this can be a great option for a B or C camera at $1,500, or a great A camera in a studio as well for doing YouTube, content creation, stuff like that. So if it can run for an extended period of time in 4K 24 and not overheat, I think this is a really viable option for a lot of people. Now, as I said earlier, this camera does have a 2-hour time limit in 4K 24. This is not a heat limit, as I said before, just an old school Canon crippled time limit. You can immediately restart the camera after it hits 2 hours, but you just have to keep that in mind. If you're running for over 2 hours, you either need to record externally or just deal with that 2-hour time limit. I think for most people, 2 hours is quite a bit. Even for myself, who's recording like a podcast or an interview, generally you don't go over 2 hours, so that's really not an issue. Now, for these longer runtime tests on the R8, keep in mind that the R8 has a pretty small battery, and I only have 2 of them. So for the first test in 4K 24, I had to swap out the battery when the first one died, but 2 batteries combined gave me 2 hours and 17 minutes. And when the second battery died, it was 7 out of 10 on the overheat bars. Now, this is interesting because Canon stated you should get 2 hours. And as I said before, I wasn't sure if the 2 hours was a record time limit or an overheat limit. So either way, we did surpass 2 hours. Now, as I said earlier, I was really curious about whether or not you could use this in a studio situation. So what I did was I set up the camera in 4K 24, but plugged it in with USB-C power delivery through the side. Now, keep in mind, you do have to have a battery inside the camera, but when I did this test, it ran for 3 hours and 19 minutes, and the card was full when it stopped, and it had 7 out of 10. So this is really interesting to me because even another hour after the first test running on batteries, we had the same overheat reading of 7 over 10. Now, I was using a 256 gigabyte card, and I did have to start the camera back up after 2 hours, but the fact that I could get 3 hours and 19 minutes and it not overheat using USB-C power delivery is pretty cool. Now, to put this in perspective and to compare it with the Canon R6 Mark II, I ran the same test in 4K 24 using USB-C power delivery, and I got, again, 3 hours and 19 minutes until the card filled up, but this time there was no overheat warning whatsoever. So the same runtime makes sense because it's the same codec and the same card. It was a 256 gigabyte card. But what was interesting was that there was no overheat warning whatsoever in the same exact situation. So of course the R6 Mark II is going to have better heat management than the R8. And also Canon states that the R6 Mark II does not have any overheat limitations in 4K 24. Now, I want to compare the R8 with some of the other Canon cameras that I've tested somewhat recently in terms of overheating with just running off of a battery. Now, I made videos about all this stuff, and I'll leave those linked down in the description below if you want to check them out. The Canon R6 Mark II ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes with no overheat warning whatsoever. The R7 ran for 2 hours and 15 minutes, but when it was done, it had a 3 out of 10 in the overheat warning. And the R5 ran for an hour and 40 minutes on the newest firmware with no overheat warning, but keep in mind that it doesn't have that out of 10 meter that some of the newer cameras have. It just has the warning and then shuts off. And the R5 still has that 30-minute record limit, so I had to get started and stopped several times. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the run times in 4K 24 on the R8 compared with the other cameras, because I think in addition to the overheating limitations of the R8, I think the small battery is going to be a challenge for a lot of people as well, because it does limit their operation quite a bit. So, as I said earlier, the R8 on the 2 batteries ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. So one battery was 1 hour 11 minutes, one was 1 hour 6 minutes. So we'll average that to about 1 hour 8 minutes. Now, to compare this with some of the other cameras, the R6 Mark II gave me 2 hours and 17 minutes. The R7, 2 hours and 15 minutes, and the R5 was 1 hour and 40 minutes. So you get about half the runtime on the R8 as you do on the R6 Mark II, and I think that's going to be challenging in a lot of situations, but I just want to let everyone know what you can expect in 4K 24. All right, so lastly, what are my takeaways? Well, first of all, it seems like you could possibly use the R8 as a studio camera if the studio is cool enough. Of course, if you're working under a lot of warm lights or in warmer conditions, I think the runtimes will go down a little bit. But what was really interesting to me was that USB-C power delivery didn't affect the overheating at all and gave you much longer runtime. Now, in some other cameras I've tested in the past, the USB-C power delivery heated up the camera more than just running the camera on its internal battery or using a dummy battery. So the fact that I can use USB-C power delivery to power the camera and didn't overheat the camera anymore is really handy and also just really useful in general. Now, I don't have a dummy battery for this because the only dummy batteries I have currently are for the LPE6N NH batteries, you know, the normal size Canon mirrorless batteries. That might help a little bit too, but as I said, in my studio here, it ran for over 3 hours using USB-C power delivery, so, you know, I think it could be useful for a lot of people out there. But just keep in mind, the run times are pretty bad, so you're gonna need a whole bunch of batteries or a way to power the camera, and in 4K 60, it's gonna overheat pretty quickly. Hopefully you found this useful, and if you did, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated. A lot more cool R8 content coming up. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.